Today's Sunday, September 18th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about a problem that I see often in efforts made by adult students to enter into the study of classical philosophy, particularly into the study of Aristotle. When I was a Protestant, I lived in New Jersey, and there was a radio program on a Christian radio station, and it was a man named Harold Camping who claimed to be a prophet who could interpret all of the events or current events taking place in the news and around the world, and he would go to the scriptures and show how all of these events going on around the world and in the news were fulfillments of prophetic passages of sacred scripture. And what he would do, and of course this was all false, but what he would do is, using the King James Bible, he would simply do word studies and build these complicated collections of passages that were simply linked together by common words. And he would show how if you string all these passages together, you can see what the message is and how it relates to the end times events that are unfolding all around us. And what I want to illustrate with this example is the danger of thinking that word studies and comparing words or linking words in different sources will help us to understand the writings or works of different authors. Just because a word may be common in philosophical studies, and in a college course, students may be taught a certain definition of a word, that definition can't be brought into different authors and different works and assumed to have the same meaning. And this is where I think adult students really struggle when they come to Aristotle after they've been introduced to philosophy through modern college or university philosophy courses. The biggest danger in these modern college and philosophy university courses is that they're often survey courses that are intended to give students an overview of different schools of philosophy, the thoughts of different philosophers, and this really presents a misleading view of philosophy. It's like studying history in a modern world history course, where we'll see the textbook divided into 36 chapters or so, and every chapter may be 10 or 15 pages, and so the Roman Empire is given just as many pages as an ancient Chinese dynasty. And because the desire in the course is to provide something of a globalist or pluralistic coverage of world history, the proportion of attention given to different civilizations or different periods is irrational, and it's misleading to students who are led to think that some relatively insignificant period of European history is worthy of the same amount of study as the Roman Empire, because that's how the textbook is laid out. The same thing happens in these modern philosophy courses, where in an attempt to try and identify the distinctive teachings of every different philosopher that we can name in history, we give as much attention, if not more, to a modern philosopher who's relatively insignificant, like Hegel or Bertrand Russell, as we do to Aristotle, who is the capital P philosopher in scholastic tradition. And so we get a very skewed and misleading view of philosophy. Then, what's even worse is we have this difficulty caused by anachronism, where students go through one of these anthology courses, one of these survey courses, and they start to pick up all of these different ideas. Terms are cast with new meanings by different philosophers, and then those meanings are read back into the writings of more ancient philosophers, and it becomes a real mess, a real mess. And so this is a source of trouble when adult students who have had some introduction to philosophy, so-called in modern colleges and universities, try to go back and actually study classical philosophy. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're assuming the value and truth of the scholastic tradition in Catholic history. We're assuming the superiority of Aristotelian philosophy. And if you think back and ask yourself, why was Aristotle not commonly taught in the Catholic Church until the 13th century? What was it about Aristotle that St. Thomas had to work to restore? The problem throughout early church history was that Aristotle's works were wrongly interpreted, and that led to false conceptions about the teachings of Aristotle, which led many Catholics to reject Aristotelian doctrine and stick with Plato. And it was Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics who established the true interpretation of Aristotle, and thereafter established Aristotle as the capital P philosopher in Catholic tradition. So we have to realize that Aristotle is very difficult to understand, and we always face the danger of misinterpretation when we study the philosophy of Aristotle. And this is true of his works on reasoning in the Organon. This is true in the rhetoric. This is true in the philosophical sciences as we go on in our studies. Now, there are two important helps, I think, that can protect us, or I should say three important helps that can protect us from really struggling with Aristotle, if not completely failing to comprehend his meaning. The first is that we have to read Aristotle for mastery. We have to read and reread and reread through all of the works of Aristotle. We have to allow Aristotle to interpret Aristotle. And as you get more and more experience in reading the works of Aristotle, you'll see that he does this quite well. But the first help that we have, the first key to rightly studying Aristotle, is we have to let Aristotle interpret Aristotle. If there's a passage that's unclear in Aristotle's works, we'll find a passage somewhere else that explains the concept more clearly. And we should allow that clearer passage to expound for us the more difficult passage that we'd previously come upon. That's the first help. Let Aristotle interpret Aristotle. Don't bring ideas of other philosophers into Aristotle, especially later ideas. That's irrational. But be careful to let Aristotle interpret Aristotle. Secondly, we have to practice very carefully the study of vocabulary in context. And this relates to the first point, but just allows us to focus on a more specific skill that's needed to study Aristotle. And this is true for any author. When we come upon a word or expression in Aristotle, we shouldn't go to a dictionary. We shouldn't think about where we've seen that word elsewhere and bring external meanings into Aristotle's works. We have to remember that words are signs of ideas, and the only right definition for any word that we read in Aristotle is the idea that Aristotle intended to signify by that word. And we have to be careful that we study vocabulary in context. I teach this to my younger students all the time because students will come upon a word that's unfamiliar and they'll immediately ask, Mr. Michael, what does that word mean? And I'll tell them, jot that word down and let's just start tracking that word as we continue reading Aristotle. And we'll seek to establish the meaning of that word in context. Vocab in context. And we can look for clues in the passages, we can look for clues in the sentences, and slowly we can start to form a clear definition of that term and understand the idea that Aristotle is using that term to signify. And that's the only right definition for that term. So we have to practice the skill of vocab in context. That's the second important skill or help in the study of Aristotle. The third, and perhaps most significant help in the study of Aristotle, is the fact that we have the commentaries that were written by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century when he was teaching at the University of Paris. We have these texts, we have the lectures of St. Thomas Aquinas where he exposited the philosophical works of Aristotle. Now, these don't cover all of Aristotle's works, but they cover the most significant of the works. They cover on interpretation in the Organon, they cover posterior analytics, they cover ethics, physics and metaphysics in the philosophical sciences. And there are many passages in St. Thomas's commentary where he goes into depth explaining Aristotle's teaching to clarify difficult points as we study through the text. And of course, Thomas Aquinas is considered the master or ultimate interpreter of the philosophy of Aristotle. So we have these three important skills or three important helps to guard against the misinterpretation of Aristotle, allowing Aristotle to interpret Aristotle, reading vocabulary and understanding vocabulary in context, and thirdly, consulting the commentaries of St. Thomas Aquinas. These three helps to guard against misinterpretation. And again, the danger for adult students, and I don't see younger students having this problem, I see it coming in adult students, is that adult students have already gone through university philosophy courses where you just have to learn what the professor says and repeat it on the examinations to get your credit. And they have picked up all kinds of ideas and explanations of terms, and they simply read all these things back into Aristotle and just create a great mess of the works of Aristotle. So I personally believe that Aristotle is not difficult to interpret if we follow these practices that I recommend. Allowing Aristotle to interpret his own works, understanding Aristotle's vocabulary in the context of Aristotle's writings, and consulting the commentaries of Thomas Aquinas to help us to understand a true interpretation of the philosophical ideas that are found in Aristotle's work. So, if you are an adult student and you have been introduced to philosophy through these modern university survey courses, I'd like you, as far as possible, to try to check all of that information at the door. as it were, and not bring it with you into the study of Aristotle. I would like you to be careful to avoid the error of anachronistic reading of Aristotle, reading an author who is establishing these philosophical sciences in the 4th century BC and allowing later ideas to guide your understanding of what Aristotle's writing, when really that's contrary to reason and impossible. Try to be conscious of that tendency and try to make sure you're not doing that, but simply read Aristotle. Allow Aristotle to explain himself. Seek to understand the vocabulary based on the context of the passage that you're reading. And if you do need to consult an outside source, consult the commentaries of Thomas Aquinas. Of course, I'm happy to help, but these are the things that I'm going to do to help students. I'm simply going to point out places where Aristotle interprets himself, help students understand vocabulary based on the context where it's found, and then provide references from St. Thomas that help to explain things. I'm not going to really provide any help that students can't get for themselves by following these same practices that I do as I study and teach the works of Aristotle. So I just wanted to highlight this source of trouble because I see adult students struggle with this. The stuff that we pick up in modern philosophy courses is so confusing and misleading, and it's better just to clear our memory, as it were, and come fresh into Aristotle and try to read it in its place in the chronology of ancient philosophy. Try not to bring too much into it, and certainly avoid the kind of shallow and overly simplified word study or word linking that I mentioned in that radio Bible teacher, who simply acts as if we can link the same words and just assume that they have common meanings. This is exactly the problem that Aristotle warns about in the first chapter of his Categories. He warns about the danger of ambiguity in the use of words that can either have multiple meanings, that can be used to signify different ideas, or that can be understood in different senses. He explains that we have to be careful to always make sure that words that we use are being used synonymously, and that means that anytime we use a word with a certain idea attached to it as its definition, the idea that it signifies, we have to make sure that anytime we use that word again, we use it with that same idea. We can't shallowly and irrationally just start linking words. Oh, because Aristotle uses this word. Oh, and we also saw that word in Plato, or we also saw that word when we were studying Descartes or someone else in a modern philosophy course. That's irrelevant. It would be better if we used different words for the different philosophers. But unfortunately, when we're studying English translations, we can't make those distinctions easily. And again, of course, you could consult the original languages or even a Latin translation of the works of Aristotle, which might be helpful to get an idea of the vocabulary. But if you don't have access to the classical languages, at least be conscious of these potential problems and try to avoid them as you study. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.